Hey everyone, I am Steve from GamersNexus.net, and today we're talking about an Enermax case. This is the Enermax LEPA Lenyx case, or the Lenyx 801 PC case. LEPA is a brand of Enermax, and the case we're looking at here today is an EATX full tower, so it's fairly large. It's certainly not as big as the Roswell B2 Spirit that we will be looking at shortly, but it is a larger case, and that classifies it as a full tower. The case MSRP is $160. It's currently selling for $170 on Amazon, but in theory that should drop to $160 through other retailers as Enermax continues to seed the case. And for basic specs, the unit ships with 3 fans, 2 200mm fans, one on the top, one in the front. Both of those are blue LED fans, and then one 140mm fan in the rear. And all 3 fans can connect to a fan controller, which is a 3-step fan controller, so it's got a low, medium, and high setting. We tested all 3 of these, and we also tested additional fan support, so you can install bottom fans in the case, including 2 120mm bottom fans. So we tested, if we add 1 fan to this case, how much of an impact does a 120mm in the bottom actually grant to performance? And that's something we look at later. The case has a lot of extras, and some of those include a USB charger port at the top. That's actually a 2.4 amp port, which is pretty high, and this is meant to be used for charging mobile devices, cell phones, things like that. So for frame of reference, I have a Moto X cell phone. My charger for my Moto X is about 1.2 amps. This puts out 2.4 amps, so it will charge much faster, but the charge will have less staying power, and it's really not that great for the lithium-ion battery. But if you wanted a very quick charge because you're about to run out the door or something, then this does have a port that does that. A lot of modern motherboards support this functionality as well. Other features include a hot swap 2.5-inch SSD bay here in the front, which is actually pretty cool because if you're spending $160 on the case, you may actually be in a position where you have a hot swap 2.5-inch drive, SSD or not. And in that case, you just plug it in the front. It's pre-wired to SATA, and then all you have to do is basically go through Windows and access the drive. There's no damage that inherently occurs from unplugging or plugging in a drive when the motherboard and the case and the drive itself all support that functionality. So you've got that there. And then on the back of the case, there is a handle that's coated in rubber, pretty nice. So that means that you can actually lift the fairly heavy case and system up from the back using a steel support beam rather than pulling on this plastic paneling that a lot of cases will force you to do. Speaking of the paneling, it's coated in a soft grip rubber paint, so the top and the front are coated in this paint. It's actually a very expensive paint, and that's part of what contributes to the high cost of the case. The side panels are standard steel coated with a matte black paint, and there's a slight difference in the color between the metal and the plastic, which I really wish didn't exist because the difference is, it's really not a big deal, but I would rather a more uniform look. Unfortunately, that is basically an unavoidable issue when you're dealing with different materials for the paneling and the side paneling. So that's what you've got there. The soft grip rubber actually does have a very nice feel to it, and the aesthetic is pretty good. I originally thought that this case would appear more plasticky because of the molding of the front and the top panels. They are definitely of the gamer aesthetic, but with the soft grip rubber, it does come out looking a little bit more professional and sleeker than the average low-end plasticky case. The specs are relatively standard otherwise. The front door does this action right here, which all that does is hide your optical drives if you don't want to show them or if you're not using them. And there are 3 5.25-inch bays here. Definitely something we've moved away from, but it is a feature that some users still demand. Enermax gets a lot of things right with the LEPA Lenyx case, and some of those things include a tooled space to allow head-on access to expansion slots, so you don't have to put the screwdriver in at an angle when installing video cards and other expansion devices, which reduces risk of cross-threading. The rear grip with the rubber coating is definitely a big plus and a small feature that they added, for which I am grateful. The split top panel is actually pretty cool as well. So the top panel mounts on rails, and it's split into a 2/3 section and a 1/3 section. The 2/3 section in the back, you just unscrew 2 thumb screws and then slide it off the rails, pull it off, and you have instant access to the radiator install and top fans if those are of interest for replacement, so that is definitely something I was a fan of, and I wish more cases would put their top paneling on rails in a similar capacity because it makes it easier to work with. Finally, Enermax puts the SSD trays on the rear of the motherboard, so you've got some of those back there just like NZXT does on its cases and a lot of other manufacturers. Ease of installation is fairly standard, no major complaints there. It's pretty easy to install a case, it's mostly toolless. There is one instance where I thought the cable management could be improved by Enermax, and that would be to add a second cutout near the CPU. So the CPU power pinouts on motherboards are normally located either in the top left of the board, meaning top left of the CPU, or in the center above the CPU, or a little more to the right if you have a certain larger board like EATX boards. So the Asus Rampage, as an example, is one of the boards we have. That has its power pinouts for the CPU located due north of the CPU. On this case, the way to get to that would be basically to go through one of the other side flanking cutouts, so you're going to have to sort of awkwardly install the power supply cable. This is really not a huge deal. It does not functionally impact the case. All it does is impact it mostly aesthetically because you've got to route the cable through more open space now, so it's exposed and it doesn't look as good. But that is a small feature that NZXT and Corsair have caught on to, and I think Enermax would benefit from as well. And then another small downside is that because of the high pressure output in the rear exhaust fan, we end up with a sort of high volume exchange of air on a lower end fan with a mesh in front of it. And what that does, because the fan is not optimized with a frictionless coating or with a better slipstream, as some of the higher end fans do have, like Silverstone's fans and Be Quiet's fans, for instance, the rear fan ends up making a lot of noise, and it's not really an irritating noise as much as it's a deep hum. It's a low frequency output. It's fairly loud, and that's from forcing all that air through a port that has a mesh, and you get sort of turbulence in there that creates the noise. So this is something that could be easily improved by changing the fan in the case, and is something that Enermax should perhaps look into in the future, but not a major issue if you lower the RPM of that fan. Let's move on to the thermal benchmarks over time and the equilibrium benchmarks, and then conclude the case review here. The LEPA Lenyx cools marginally better than the Nexus 450 for CPU and GPU temperatures, outputting 48.42 Celsius of heat on the CPU at equilibrium and 20.6 Celsius on the GPU at equilibrium. Looking at the temperature over time charts, our automated tests align the benchmark perfectly and show the Lenyx is slightly warmer than the Fantex Mini XL. We later found that it's also warmer than the B2 Spirit. We're testing a number of other cases in the background. And we tested the fan controller on all three settings for the Lenyx, low, medium, high, finding that the thermals are effectively identical on all of these. This is likely due to a bottleneck created by the thick plastic bars on the front and top of the case, which restrict air intake to the point that it throttles the fan potential more than the controller does. So to this end, you're really better off just kind of leaving the fan controller at one setting and ignoring it. When we added a 120mm 1200 RPM bottom fan, we saw a 14 Celsius improvement in CPU thermals, which is a gigantic change, and that is potentially an oversight by Enermax. It's definitely something we think should be included stock, and if it isn't, then you should be buying one pretty early in the process because it's a big cooling difference. Overall, the case impressed me with its feel of the coating and look. I really was expecting something much more plasticky and a lower quality aesthetic, but that is not what we got here, thankfully. It's actually a pretty nice appearance overall, and the thermals are average. They're par for the course, nothing special there, but the extras on the case are well thought out and show an attention to detail for smaller items that I think Enermax deserves some notice for. The front SSD port, the supercharger in the top, and then my favorite is just the small handle and the rails for the top panel of the case. Those are all small things that definitely don't make the case functionally better from a cooling perspective, but portability and other things, it adds a bit of character. The biggest downfall of the LEPA Lenyx case is its price point. At $160 MSRP and $170 retail through Amazon and Newegg right now, the case is actually in direct competition with some heavyweights in the industry, including Corsair's 760T, which is actually one of my favorite cases right now, and that has a heavier use of rigid Strawn Metals. It has a very large tempered glass side panel. There's slightly different markets for each of these cases, but Corsair definitely is a bigger name, and they're going to have some power in that department. Other cases around the same price point would include the NZXT Nexus 450. That's $140. It is a smaller case, but it does compete in the gamer aesthetic category in terms of appearances for cases. And then there's also Rosewell's B2 Spirit, which is gigantic. It's bigger than this, and it's sort of a mini server setup if you have a lot of hard drives. So there are a lot of different options at this price point. Some of them are more direct competition than others, but at the end of the day, it comes down to preference for aesthetics, because structurally and in terms of functionality, this case is at least on par with the others, if not slightly ahead in some areas. The plastic coating is a plus that some other companies haven't figured out yet or just don't want to pay for. So there's pros and cons to all of them. I would feel fine endorsing this case. I wish the price point were $140 instead, because at $160, I'm probably a buyer of the 760T instead, or even some of Silverstone's cases are cheaper, and like the Raven 05 is a very good option that has more focus on cooling functionality than this case does. So it's not a bad case, it just has a lot of fierce competition, and the main reason to select this case, or really any other one in direct competition, is because you like the look of it and the look and feel of the plastic. So that is the LEPA Lenyx case. It is the 801 PC case. Check the article for full details on the review. And of course, if you like this content, please check out our Patreon page. It helps us out a lot, and we're trying to move some of our support base over to that going forward. So that is all for this video. I will see you all next time.